this is a sort of a difficult and contentious subject to talk on, because very many people will have different views developed over periods of time, and I've been in practice for nearly 30 years, and my knowledge about wing conditions has been evolving all the time. I think the objective of today's talk would be to really try and maybe explain some of the terminology, which is very confusing, because there's a lot of confusion about wing conditions in horses, and to show examples of different conditions, and to demonstrate the big changes that are occurring in both our methods of diagnosis and in the ways of treating specific conditions. And lastly, maybe to help to outline maybe a management strategy for horses with respiratory conditions. And my point here is that surgery is not always immediately indicated. To follow on the theme of confusion, there's an awful lot of terminology. Here's on a small sample, and you've histlers and roarers, and the trainer says he swallowed his tongue and he was gurgling and there was rattles and there was gasping sounds, and sometimes there's no sound at all but the horse stopped. And sometimes the noises can be intermittent. Sometimes you can hear a whistle at the end of exercise, at the end of a gallop. Sometimes it's at the start. Sometimes it's in one rein, sometimes it's not on the other. Sometimes the horse is perfectly okay in a straight line, but in a turn he makes a whistle. So these are terminologies that we have to get through. The next point is that there are different people have different views, and the jockey has one viewpoint on one aspect of viewpoint on wing conditions. And sometimes it's a kind of a self-interested viewpoint, because there are many jockeys who are coming into second last fence and there may be contention to win, and the horse suddenly starts making a noise. Does he take a pull? Does he sit still? Or does he keep kicking? And I think that's a decision. Obviously the trainer has a viewpoint, the owner, and then the vet. There's all different viewpoints, and you've got to sort of try and distill all those viewpoints actually into what is actually going on, not people's opinions. Not all wind problems are the same. Very often you get a phone call saying my horse has got a wind problem, send them up for an operation. What operation? You know, and people maybe want to send them up and they don't want any further diagnosis done. And wind conditions can appear. Here we've got an example. On the left we've got a horse with an epiglottic entrapment, and on the right is a horse with a displacing palate, with swallowing tongue, gurgling, rattles, whatever you like to call it. But sometimes an epiglottic entrapment isn't always visible when you scope. It's intermittent, so you can scope the horse at rest and he's perfectly normal. Scope him the following day, and if you were lucky enough to scope him at that point in time when it was entrapped, you would see it, otherwise you wouldn't. Sometimes entrapped horses make very little abnormal noise, and they can be there for months before the trainer actually realises that something has been going on. Sometimes they do make a noise. Equally with horses that with displacing palates. 30% of horses that displace their palate make no abnormal noise whatsoever, and I think a lot of people would find that hard to believe. And then with wind conditions, you know, the horse is coming around to the last 3 furlongs and suddenly stops. People automatically presume the horse has got a wind problem, surgical correction. You've got to think of medical problems, you know, obviously bleeders. If the horse comes in with blood in his nose, that's easy, but sometimes horses will bleed internally and you'll see no external signs of blood. Sometimes you might hear 1 or 2 little coughs when the horse is coming back into the parade ring, which can be a telltale sign that the horse has bled, but not always. I would also point out too that at the races, the horses are brought in within 20 minutes or half an hour to check have they bled. Now, that's a useful exercise, but there are some horses that won't show signs of bleeding the trachea until it'll be an hour and a half or 2 hours after the race. So you've got to just keep an open mind the whole time of what's going on. So medical conditions, horses have got allergies, inflammatory airway disease. More and more horses are now being trained from the field, because in the stable their lungs just get too stuffy and allergic, lung infections. So you've got to keep an open mind on what actually is causing the poor performance. Further confusion is regarding the corrective surgery. People ring up and say, I want to tie forward, tie back, tie sideways, whatever. A lot of the terminology is confusing. Tie back and tie forward sound very similar. They are both 2 completely different surgeries for 2 completely different things. Got pinfire palates, myectomies, staphylectomies. I could go on for a long time, and I think I get confused, and I'm sure trainers and owners have got to get confused as well. How do you identify a wind problem? Usually it's the jockey who comes along and says this horse has probably got a wind problem, because he is the person. Wind problems in high performance horses, the time it really becomes evident is in the final quarter of a race when a horse is under maximum pressure. And the only person who was there at that time is the jockey. And so he is the person who probably is most likely to hear something abnormal. And just as Celia describes checking for hearts, you know, once the horse has stopped galloping, comes back in, there's nothing to be seen. You put a scope into the mouth in the races, the larynx looks normal again. There's no sign of it displacing palate, or maybe that epiglottis that was entrapping has unentrapped. So you're relying very much on the jockey. And it is difficult for jockeys too, because you know they're often in the room with a lot of other horses. It can be hard to absolutely pinpoint the sound. As a vet, it will be extremely nice to actually be sitting behind the jockey so you could listen at that point in time. So jockey is not normal noise. Poor performance. Obviously the horse has performed below what the trainer had expected him to perform, and he's then going to maybe think a reason. It's also worth knowing that horses that have wind problems, whether they're choking or gurgling, if it happens too often, they lose confidence. They actually know, I mean, they can feel what's going on in their throat. And if they displace a number of times and it upsets them, they are going to know at what stage that's going to happen again. So if it happens too often, they will actually start going in the race and maybe easing themselves back just before actually the problem manifests itself. And you hope to solve and get the problems before that happens, because you may be able to have some surgical or medical solution for a wind problem, but if it gets into the horse's head of confidence and his confidence is gone, there's nothing the vet can do about it. It's the trainer's job to try and get the horse's confidence back again. Sometimes the horse will throw his head up or hold his head high when the palate displaces, or they get a problem with the wind. Obviously endoscopy is very useful, but it doesn't tell the whole story. Endoscopy at rest, and it's interesting talking about Sir Mark Prescott here. He was one of the early people using the endoscope, and certainly when I qualified, and I worked with Kieran Breeden, who I think was a tremendous vet and a tremendous innovative vet in his time, and what we know now is hugely different to what we knew then, and I suppose in 10-20 years time there'll be some other diagnostic method we'll even know even more. So keep an open mind. All of these things, in my view, are unreliable for really accurately diagnosing what's gone. This Hungarian horseman has probably got as much chance of diagnosing wind conditions as we do with the conventional information that we've been using to date, in my view. I would therefore say, with the development of endoscopy at exercise, it has completely transformed what we know and found out is going on. And it's essential for an accurate diagnosis, in my view. Otherwise you're just guessing. Guess away and you might be right, but there'll be critical times when you'll guess wrong, and you'll maybe do the wrong surgery, and if you've got a valuable horse, doing the wrong surgery for a wind condition will damage that horse. And in my view, there's been many horses that have been unnecessarily operated on, or operated on incorrectly, and I think who knows what those horses could have been done if the right approach had been taken. Obviously we can do we started off doing the treadmill endoscopy back in 2001, and we used it very satisfactorily for a long period of time. It has been somewhat taken over by the overground scope, and we'll go into the comparison between the two systems a little bit later. Just a small recap on treadmill tests. This is one of the first systems that was set up. It was the first system in private practice to put in the world, and the sound is not working here, but it's quite a dramatic thing doing the treadmill test. But thoroughbred horses take to it like ducks to water. I'll turn off the noise. Thoroughbred horses tolerate treadmill testing really, really well. Now you just take a little bit of time. Most horses actually can probably be trained within, well, some horses come in the morning and you can do the test in the afternoon. When we were doing treadmills, we did it over 3 days with the horse in, and we kind of walked them around and got them used to it, and maybe the second day we did a canter, and the third day we did the test. But they really like it, not a problem. Show jumpers tend to want to jump out, but race horses at the gallop. I would be of the view, having done the treadmill testing for 10 years and now doing more overland scopes, is that the treadmill test actually is more accurate in pinpointing some wind conditions than the overground scope, and I'll go into that now in a second. This is the overground endoscopy system. As you can see, it's got no backpack. It's just got little side pouches to the saddle, and we'll just give you a little demonstration of that in action. This was just one that we did we're over in the Middle East. We have a contract out in the Middle East to do some treadmill testing, and we go out there on some occasions. This is an example of doing it there. And it's just interesting. It's one of the problems that we have with the overground scope, is that we have no real control of the jockey. When we're doing a treadmill test, I or one of the nurses are in control of the horse speed, and we can watch the video and we can make the horse push on a little bit, hold back a little bit, and we can actually find problems. Sometimes with the overground endoscopy systems, the jockey will set off and the horses aren't worked hard enough. You're not replicating race conditions. Because you've got to remember, a lot of these subtle wind problems only occur at maximum exercise. It's the last quarter of a race, which probably horses maybe at home with the regular work aren't quite reaching. If we get the diagnosis properly, we have to be near that. And so that is one of the small drawbacks, and I wouldn't say small drawbacks of the overground system, is that you're a little bit in control of the jockey. In this case, for example, the horses weren't working. It was a 2-year-old, now it was an immature 2-year-old in fairness, so he couldn't work them that hard. But ideally, I would like the horses worked a little bit harder for a good diagnosis. So just to recap on maybe the advantages, disadvantages of both systems. In the treadmill, you've got better control of the speed and intensity. Also, even though you heard a lot of the galloping sounds, when you're standing beside that horse in the treadmill test, when the problem starts to develop, you can hear it. So as a vet, you can as closely mimic the situation of a jockey with a treadmill test, because you can hear what's going on, you can hear the various noises that are made. Also, you can vary the pace. You can slow the horse down. If the palate's beginning to billow a little bit, you can slow the horse down again. You push him on a little bit more, slow him down, push him on, and if it was going to displace, you can make him displace. You haven't got that control of the jockey. The jockey starts at the end of the old Vic or the circular gallop, and he does what he does, and then he comes back and you got your video. You can ask him to go around again maybe, but sometimes you can't put the horses to exhaustion. Disadvantage of the treadmill perhaps is a slightly longer training time. He has to come in the clinic maybe for a day or 2 days to be done. As I say, 90% of the tests we do nowadays are the overground scope, but we still do some treadmill testing. We're still keeping it because we find it useful. Advantage of the overground endoscopy system, obviously it's more convenient. You can go down to the gallops, you can meet the trainer there, you put the system on the horse, and away you go. It has the advantage too of that the rider is on the horse's back, and the rider does have an influence on wind conditions, because I'm sure a lot of you know when you've got younger horses going out in the gallops, and when you're starting off with them and you start pulling up, then a bit of work, and when you actually pull up, they start hearing a gurgling sound. But they have made no sound in that maximum exercise, and that's to do with the change in position of the horse's neck. Because when the horse pulls its head in, it changes the relationship of the larynx cartilages to the position of the palate. So some jockeys riding horses very carefully, that have a tendency to displace their palate, if they ride them carefully and not pulling them back and changing position to a very smooth run, they can actually avoid the horse having a palate problem. So the overground system mimics how rider on the back, it's more convenient, but I will also say the horses often are not worked hard enough to mimic the very subtle conditions. So this is just a study that Franklin did in 2010, and saying that soft palate problems are diagnosed less often during overground endoscopy than during treadmill endoscopy. So these would be cases where they would have not diagnosed them on overground scope, put the horses on a treadmill, and then diagnosed the displacing palate. Hillier also demonstrated the same findings. So we're just going to go over a few little systems. See where the drink. We're going to go over a few examples of a few problems that we see, and before we start, I'm just going to recap on some of the anatomy. I'm sure you're all familiar with it, but it's no harm to recap. So what we have here now is the horse's arytenoid cartilages. This is going down to the horse's trachea. These are the vocal cords, which are not really visible. They're held tightly to the side of the horse's side of it, the larynx. This is his epiglottis now. It's only a partial view on the picture, but on the diagrammatic you can see the epiglottis, which is a kind of a triangular cartilaginous material, and that epiglottis acts like a button, like a coat button. So underneath that epiglottis you have a very soft, floppy material called the palate, and that epiglottis holds that palate down. The purpose of the palate in real life is Up here is the horse's gullet. This is his airway. So when a horse eats, you don't want food going down into the airway. So his palate flips up, blocks off the airway, and food goes down into the gullet. When a horse is galloping, he wants to get maximum exercise, so the palate's got to stay right down out of the way. And it's a bit like snoring in people. What happens in people who snore is their palate billows up into the airway and starts making a very abnormal noise. And so this is what is happening with horses that develop soft palate problems. Then we have laryngeal paralysis, whistlers. And just wanted to recap a little bit of the grading of larynxes at rest, because people are familiar with what grade is he? Is he grade 1, is he grade 2? And they say, well, if he's a grade 2, oh, that's not as good as grade 1. Now, it's just an arbitrary grading system. The grading from 1 to 5 is a system that we tend to use more often in Ireland than any others. There are about 10 other grading systems that are used worldwide. And it's a little bit arbitrary, it's a little bit subjective. And I would stress that on this system that we use in Ireland, 1 and 2 are normal. 2 is no better than 1. Most horses are probably 2s. Grade 3 is the first level of laziness in the larynx that we would consider pathological, and in general they respond well to Hobday surgery and do very, very well. Grade 4 is a little bit more paralysis, and they require more severe surgical intervention, such as a tie back, and maybe combined with some laser surgery. And the grade 5s may be better off left in some situations. So we'll have a small little video here of a normal larynx, and you can see the symmetry and the synchronous. When I say synchronous, that both left and right move synchronously. One doesn't move out of rhythm or out of time with the other side, left and right. This is the horse's left side, because it's a mirror image. This is the side that often shows paralysis. So this is a scoping horse at rest, and we can see this is normal. You can see the 2 vocal cords there and the ventricles. These entities have guttural pouch, which really aren't a problem. This is the palate down here, and these are the walls of the pharynx. So a little bit later on, you'll see where all these things come in relative. Now, this is the most extreme example of paralysis. This is grade 5 paralysis. This was done at rest. There was no need for an overground or an exercise endoscopy to see this. Anybody could see this on scope straight away. Grade 5 paralysis, totally paralysed. This side is falling in completely, and you can see how much airway that's blocking off and performance affecting. Just a little diversion here. Why does it occur in horses? It's really quite interesting. Why? And why is it always the left side? 95%, 99% of the time, it's the left side, not the right side. And why don't we get it on the right side? And a popular explanation that we're told in college was that the nerve going to the left side is much longer than the nerve going to the right side. I won't go into the anatomical details, but it goes down around the base of the arteries to the heart and then comes right back up. Why it does that, God only knows, but whereas the right side takes a more direct route. So that's the kind of the general explanation. It's a longer nerve, therefore more prone to degeneration. I think we are very, very aware, and you are very, very aware of the genetic predisposition. There's a big hereditary element in the thoroughbreds, and it's a problem that is inbred in thoroughbreds, and we probably never breed it out of them. But the interesting thing is, giraffes are equidae. They probably have the longest laryngeal nerves of any of the equidae. They never get laryngeal paralysis. So, and then we have, there are definitely breed dispositions. There's some breeds that just don't get it. There's some, Connemara ponies really very, I'm not aware of Connemara ponies getting it. So we still don't really know why horses get it. So it's difficult to diagnose by endoscopy at rest. And again, I would say, and I'm sure at sales time, you find it very frustrating, because there are horses that maybe make a whistle after the fall of the hammer, and you then send them to the panel, and the panel will scope them, and at rest, the horse scopes normally. You then have to take him. And then you might then go on training a little bit later on, and you hear this whistle all the time, and subsequently maybe have an overground scope done, and you find that actually at exercise this horse, it is falling in, even though at rest it's normal. And there are also, the contralateral happens is that there are also horses that fail the resting scope, and you put the scope in and they're grade 3 and even sometimes in grade 4 at rest, but you put those in overground scope, and they're actually getting fully opening, fully functioning larynxes. So it really is confusing. The other thing to bear in mind is that there are frequently a combination of problems occurring at the same time. And we'll go into that in a second. This is just an example. The first case now, if we look at this at rest, we sort of be fairly happy. You know, I think that's fairly symmetrical. You know, it's well, good and open. You know, that is the horse that at rest I think would pass any panel, I would think. So we just run the video here now. And even at this stage, he's a good bit into exercise at this stage. I've edited this video, and he's good bit into exercise. And even well into 2/3 the way into exercise, it's still fairly symmetrical there. But just watch now. We can see things begin to happen. Things become a bit floppy, and it becomes a bit lax here. The vocal cords have become a bit more prominent. He's starting to hanging in here, isn't he? This is now beginning to fall in. So the left side, and now he's displaced his palate. And you can see how the palate really at some stage completely blocks off the airway. So this is a horse with two problems. And you know, if you were sent up to us and we just scoped him at rest, I don't know, you want to put your hand in the lucky bag to decide what surgery to do. Whereas at least, having done the overground scope, we're in a better situation that this horse absolutely would have to have a tie back if he was to have any chance. And he would need the vocal cords removed because they're involved as well. And he would need something done with his palate. Okay, this is an extreme example. This is a case where at rest, this horse was normal. But at maximum exercise, he got left side, we call dynamic collapse of the arytenoid. And you can see, I mean, look, that's all he's got to breathe through. And interesting, just look here, this is the right vocal cord. That's quite interesting, because often they say that, you know, horses never get a right-sided problem. But this is the right vocal cord that is now hanging in quite dramatically. And we are seeing more of those on overground scopes where everything else is normal, but just the right cord is hanging in. Then that means a right-sided cordectomy rather than the usual left side. So let's look at treatments. You know, treatments for hob days, horses that have whistle or roar, and we can look at, you know, the traditional hob day, which is involving removing the left vocal cord and the ventricle, and that will stop the noise. The reason you hear the noise is if the ventricle hangs open, it's like going for a milk bottle top. If you blow over the top of a milk bottle top, you'll hear a kind of a hollow whistle sound. And it's the same thing with horses galloping, and so you will eliminate the noise. It was contentious among vets and among people, saying, well, we're only eliminating the noise, but you're really not doing anything else, and you're not improving the horse's performance. And I think with some of the recent work we have done, it actually does more than just eliminating the noise. I was sort of being a bit cynical at one stage, saying, well, you should remove the noise, because if the jockey doesn't hear the noise, you keep riding hard, and he won't worry going to the second last fence. I'm sure Andrew will be conscious of that. But I think it is more than that. That the noise creates turbulence, and turbulence has an effect on the amount of oxygen that's going through. And you've got to think like a raging river. If you imagine a raging river going down, which is what the amount of air is going through this small narrow gap, and if there's a branch sticking even slightly into that raging river, it creates huge currents and eddies, which affects the flow of water. Same thing with air going through the larynx. So therefore, hob day is definitely indicated in my view. Now, do you go for the traditional hob day, or maybe look more recently we're doing more and more laser surgery? And you know, more and more we do a lot of traditional hob days. When I was in England, I mean, I've worked with many, you know, good wind surgeons. I started off with Kieran Breeden over here in the Curragh, who in my view was one of the best I've ever worked with. I thought he was an amazing guy. And I spent some time with Geoffrey Brain in England. You know, he's father of Ben Brain now. And, you know, they were pioneers at the time. But things are moving on, have moved on. You know, the old idea of just turning over a horse over on his back, opening up the larynx, looking in, and then the idea was by looking into the larynx, you could actually tell what the palate was like, what the aeroglottic folds were doing. That's bunkum in my view now. You can't tell by just looking in, even under surgery. You can only tell by exercise endoscopy. So what laser surgery offers now is a more refined technique of removing specific areas of tissue that are blocking the airway. That's not to say that the old traditional hub day is not being done, and we still do very, very many of them. So this is just a small example of the grade 3 paralysis. This is the slightest degree, and we can just see, this is just, we draw a line across there, it's just hanging in ever so slightly. This is done at rest. And just as a matter of interest, this is one that Cormac did at the surgery here, and it's removing a right vocal cord. I remember I said earlier on that sometimes we can specifically get right vocal cord collapse. So in this situation, you see with laser surgery how we can actually very accurately remove the offending piece of tissue. This is like a video game. It's quite frustrating to do because the horse is moving, the people holding the scope is moving. There's about 10 different things moving, so to actually do this is, but with experience, the technique you can get, we get very confident you do it well. And then we've moved the vocal cord, and it's now just removing the ventricle, which is actually the inside lining of the pocket. So it's sealing off that side completely. Okay, so with the grade, this is grade 3. With the grade 4, where it's hanging in so badly, you have to do something more dramatic. The the hub day is not sufficient to help the airway. And that's where we have to do a tie back. And that's where we put a suture through 2 of the cartilages from the outside, and you actually tie the larynx permanently open. And because it's a more severe problem, and because it's a more severe surgery, the success rate is not as good with tiebacks as it is with hub days, because it's a more serious problem. And also, it's not as successful in galloping racehorses as it is in eventers and show jumpers, but success rate is really quite good. And that again is a little bit to do with the speed of the rate that the thoroughbred is going at. But we've done a lot of work in the last number of years to improve the tieback technique. So it is always evolving. And I know mostly maybe disillusioned with tiebacks and people have a lot of disappointments with them. But equally, you've had many good successes. There are horses that have done tiebacks and won 5, 6, 7, 8 races. And there's a difference in horses. Some horses have soft cartilage, some horses have brittle cartilage. Some horses just, they don't like the feeling of their larynx being tied open the whole time and get upset and get gag and swallow and choking problems. And it's very hard to predict beforehand which horses will accept it and which horses won't. So this is a question of surgery at the moment. We're just monitoring how much we're tying it back. This is a system we have developed where we have a little ratcheting system to tighten the suture notch by notch until we get the exact amount of tie back that we want or would think is optimum. So we'll just talk about some of the soft palate problems now. And I alluded to earlier was that 30% of horses that displace their palate make no abnormal noise. That's really important take-home message, because so many people said horses stopped, he made no noise, he can't have a palate problem. Well, I would disagree with that entirely. And so we just one little video here now of a horse. And watch out towards the end, because something very interesting happens. And watch this epiglottis. See the epiglottis? Well, it's gone now because the palate is flipped over. So the button hasn't kept the soft palate in place, and he's choking away. And so I suppose if we just stop there now, we'd say, oh well, he just needs palate surgery and nothing else. But just watch a little bit longer, and I just get a very sneak preview of it. There, just that last point there. Let's see if we go back to it again if I can. Play. And you just get a little hint there that the epiglottis is flipped up, but it's not that fine outline triangular shape. It's actually entrapped. The epiglottis is entrapped as well as displacing his palate. So that means that this horse needs different surgical intervention than what we otherwise would have thought. And I alluded to earlier on that some horses will ease up in exercise before the palate displaces. So that's why when we're doing the overground scope, sometimes by the treadmill can actually push them on that a little bit more and actually make them do it to help the diagnosis. This is some personal experience. People accuse vets of not having, I mean, as an amateur jockey 30 years ago, I had good experience of riding horses with palate problems. This is one particular horse, and on the right hand, on the left hand side, he was going very well in the Latouche Cup in Punchestown. He led 3/4 of the way until he choked up over a fence. Literally, one stride out before the fence, he choked and gurgled and then collapsed over the fence. And this is him choking. This is actually not joking. In Punchestown, the Latouche, that's the final fence in Goran Park. And so I know what it's like going in two strides out and hear a gurgling sound. It's a bit worrying. So management for pallets, you know, every horse is different, and young horses that are just coming into training, you know, a huge percentage of them, especially national hunt horses, will start gurgling, and even 2-year-olds starting off will start gurgling. They're unfit, they're flabby. You've got to think there are innumerable number of muscles in the horse's throat, and they have to get strong the same way as all the other muscles have got to get strong. And you know, you put the allegory to an opera singer. Like, you could have the genetic ability to be a fantastic opera singer, but the amount of muscles you need to opera sing are phenomenal. So you just cannot, you need years of training to actually get those muscles strong to be able to opera sing. And a little bit the same way is with race horses. So horses need time, so therefore you get this request, he's been in training 6 weeks and he's gurgling, I want him operated on. You know, in my view, absolutely the wrong thing to do. That those horses need time to get strong, get fit, and that could be a considerable length of time. They get mature. Also, you know, the ground, you all know, has a big influence. You know, some horses will make wind problems in very heavy ground, whereas on the top of the ground, they make no noise whatsoever. Some distance can have an effect, so you might think about changing the distance. Some horses, especially in flat horses, if they have severe, I've had horses with severe epiglottic entrapments that have won listed and group races over 5 and 6 furlongs, you know, no problem. So think about the distance that you're running at. The jockey influence is important, because you know, jockeys that are pulling and bringing the horse back in and turning him around, that can have an effect on whether the horses go to this place or get other problems. You're all aware of the cross nosebands, the tongue tie, the Australian nosebands. There are various bits that can be used, but I'm a great believer in actually giving the horses time rather than just rushing in and operating on them. And I had a kind of a salutary lesson a couple of years ago where we had a 2-year-old in the back end of the season, and had the jockey came back from Leopardstown. The jockey said, this horse needs a wind surgery. He was booked in for a wind surgery. We eventually persuaded we could get this horse an overground scope. We did an overground scope on him, and actually it wasn't too bad. You know, his palate was a little bit lax, billowy, but he didn't displace him. We worked the horse hard. So he said, I just don't think you should operate on this horse now. I think he's a 2-year-old. If you have to operate on him, do it maybe in the beginning of next year, or 3-year-old year, or do it at the end of his 2-year-old career. And so they kept going with him, and the filly won a listed race 3 weeks later. But you know, if we just operated on her, she never would have won that listed race. So just, you need to think very carefully about your management plan. So if we've done the conservative treatment, we've tried everything, and some of the statistics say that 60% of horses will improve with conservative treatment only. And you know, you can use drugs, some of them have got infections, some have got inflammation, so they can have cortisone, they can have antibiotics, all the rest of it, nebulizers, all of those sort of things, they'll all help a little bit. So I would sort of expect 60% of horses to probably get better just with conservative treatment. But there are still 40% that won't get better, and these are obviously the ones you've distilled now, the ones that are a problem. And what are you going to do with them? Again, personally would be kind of cautious. Depends on time. You know, obviously some people are up against time, and the flat trainers are more up against time than the national hunt trainers, and so therefore they may go into more extreme, you know, tie forward straight away. But for the national hunt horses that are looking at a prolonged career, I would look at the minimal intervention to start off with. And cauterizing the palate, I think, is a really useful exercise. And this originally stems back from humans with snoring. And maybe 20 years ago, with people with snoring, they started burning people's palates with laser. And little lines of laser on people's palates. The idea was to stiffen the palate. And the human surgeon that developed this was a keen sailor. And I don't know if any of you ever do sailing, but in sailing, on the free edge of the sail, if you don't put battens are little stiff rods that go into the sails along the edge of the sail. And if those battens, if you forget to put them in, the sail does this, okay, flapping all over the place. So this human surgeon who was a sailor kind of thought, well, if we can actually get this palate and actually put little batons into the palate, it'll make it stiffer. And the idea of cauterizing it is it produces scar tissue, and of course scar tissue is stiffer, and therefore that's the principle. So it was Norman Chandler in Yorkshire who actually, and like I'm a bit like Sir Mark Prescott, you know, claiming credit for something really which maybe I shouldn't claim for, but I remember back, you know, seeing this situation 25 years ago about discussing this, and I discussed with very many people about how you would cauterize it and how you would laser it. And I was thinking about laser at the stage, and we didn't have a laser. But Norman Chandler said, well, forget the laser. He just got a big hot iron firing iron, opened up and just burnt it, and found actually he was getting quite good results. Subsequent to that, with the development of laser, people started lasering pallets to try and stiffen them, a bit akin to what was done in humans. Now, in our experience, lasering pallets is a waste of time, because it doesn't produce the scar tissue in horses that it does in humans. And the analogy I would make is, if you want to barbecue a steak, and that's what you have to do with a pallet, we've learned. If you want to barbecue a steak, you put it on a barbecue. You don't get a laser. If you got a laser out to barbecue a steak, it'll probably take 3 weeks to actually get the steak properly done. So that's why, in my view, laser doesn't really work satisfactorily. So then getting on to cauterizing. Initially we started cauterizing pallets, and we were ever so gentle. And we would do something with a lovely design like this, and that looks lovely. That actually is a waste of time. It's not enough. When we're cauterizing pallets, you have to really and burn the tissue so it gets a chance to become stiff. Now, you might say, gosh, that is terribly cruel. It's done under anaesthetic. Horses tolerate it surprisingly well. That they, within a day, they are back eating and they're quite relaxed, and it is not an overly painful procedure. They tolerate it well, and we get kind of good results with it. Obviously, if then, of that 40% that haven't responded to conservative treatment, we've cauterized the pallet on these ones. The magic 60%, about 60% of those in or around respond to cauterizing the pallet. And you're still down now to another sort of 40% of that 40% that haven't responded. And that's where we then have to look at more aggressive surgeries. And I think then obviously looking at tie forwards. And tie forward has a very useful place to play and I found it more useful in flat horses than in national hunt horses. And one of the downsides of national hunt horses is that if you're looking at a national hunt horse that has got a longevity of maybe, hopefully, 4 or 5 years of progressing down the scale, the prostheses sometimes don't always hold in the tie forward. And sometimes you get an imbalance, sometimes there's 2 sutures put in, one either side. And sometimes if it goes to the cartilage on one side, you can get an imbalance. So that's why I'm always careful, if I've got a horse with a long career in front of it, of putting too much material that will be never removed in there. But when it's needed and it's successful. Some of the older techniques, staphylectomies where you cut the free end of the pallet, is very rarely done now. But I know when I was with Kieran Breeden, we did very, very many horses with staphylectomies with phenomenally good results. And I think how that worked, it's not a very elegant procedure, but I think how that worked is that it shortened the pallet. So when the pallet did displace, it didn't come back so far, and therefore couldn't block off the airway. The downside is sometimes horses could regurgitate food down through their nose with that surgery, so it wasn't. Only a few more videos now. They're quite exciting ones, and then you can let you all go. This is just an epiglottic entrapment, and we saw this earlier on, and you can see where it's like a double chin. So imagine the epiglottis is a triangular piece of cartilage, and you've got a big double chin of extra tissue. And this tissue becomes, for whatever reason, becomes longer and longer and stretched, and it kind of flips over and engulfs the point of the chin. So you can see here, you can see the nice scalloped, sharp edge border of the epiglottis. The tissue is covering it over. And it's amazing how long horses can be with this condition without the trainer or anybody realizing it's there. And one of the downsides is that if the epiglottis is entrapped permanently, it's not flipping in and out, and is left there for quite a long time, it actually changes the shape or remodels the actual epiglottis. So the epiglottis can actually become snub-nosed and damaged and ulcerated. So therefore, when you do come to operate on it, you are left with a deformed epiglottis. So that can be one of the reasons why sometimes epiglottic entrapment surgery won't be successful. Obviously, these ones need to be operated on, and they need to be operated on, ASAP. And you need to decide what technique to use. And what has become more fashionable recently is using the hook knife up through the nose, and which just basically, this hook knife up the nose and just splits that bit of tissue there, and it folds back and it releases the entrapment. And it's fine and it works, and horses have done well after it. The downside to it in our view is that all this tissue remains, and it folds back underneath the epiglottis, and it actually forms a little lump underneath the epiglottis, and it forms a thing called a granuloma or a kind of a sore. And so I think as a long-term solution, splitting it with a knife wouldn't be our preferred option. The other risk with splitting with the knife is that there are at least 2 lawsuits each year in the UK and Ireland. With when you split it with the knife, a hook knife, razor sharp, goes on the long end of a hook and goes in and catches the end of that catch, and you go and use it, and you just go to pull. And sometimes if you pull too hard, or it suddenly gives, the knife comes right back and it splits the palate. So it's not risk-free using the hook knife. So that's led us on to maybe the preferred option of using the laser again for removing it. And this is a slightly edited version of just operating on an epiglottic entrapment, and you can see where we just picked up the tissue with a forceps, and you're dissecting out the full amount of tissue. So when this tissue is taken away, it's removed for good, and it's like a permanent solution to this problem. And I just hope to come to the end of it now in a second. You can see the result. So that's the tissue being held up there. You can see now we're just slowly dissecting it out. And there we nearly got frustrating laser surgery. It takes an awful, you always think you're there and you're not quite there. We are there now. And so we can see, got a very nice, the epiglottis is back in its lovely shape again, and it looks really good. And we've had a good bit of success on quite high profile horses, a number of high profile horses in Ireland, and we've gone over to the UK to do this, and this is a successful procedure. This is another completely new condition that we knew nothing of when we were doing scoping at rest. And these are folds of tissue, complicated name, ariepiglottic fold. The reason, this is the arytenoid cartilage, this is the epiglottis, so therefore they combined a combination of vascularization of ariepiglottic and called ariepiglottic fold. So it's a fold of tissue. This fold of tissue, we always presumed to stay stable and never did anything, because when we scoped at rest, it always did that. But we have a little video here of what it can do. You see, it's not the vocal cords, because the vocal cords are normal in this horse. Well, they're flipping a little bit, but they're in the inside here, but they're winking. And so you get a collapse of the ariepiglottic folds, or axial deviation of the ariepiglottic folds, the complicated name for it. Interesting thing enough, this usually happens at maximum exercise, and it coincides, the horse starts to make a whistle. And these horses that do this, for example, never make a whistle at home. They never make a whistle at the sales. You can lunge them both ways, you can do whatever you like, they never make a whistle. The only time they make a whistle is the jockey says he makes a whistle in the last 2 furlongs, because this only happens at maximum exercise, and that actually mimics a whistling sound. And you say, oh, we'll hobtail. Hobtailing is completely the wrong thing to do with a horse. It wouldn't do him any good whatsoever. So what he needs is, with the laser, you can actually remove those folds of tissue away completely, so they are completely out of the way. And again, that is really quite a successful surgery. Just subepiglottic cyst, this is an interesting one. Horses are born with subepiglottic cysts. It's often a congenital problem, and it's a little cyst of tissue, and you can just see it peaking just about there. But there are some cysts that are really quite devious, because going in at rest, a number of horses, it looks absolutely normal, and there can be a cyst, and quite a big cyst sitting underneath the epiglottis, and you can't see it. There are 2 ways of maybe trying to establish it, whether there is a cyst there or not. It's actually getting a big long iron and sort of lifting up the epiglottis and looking underneath it, and we do that. We don't do it sort of routine on every examination or at the sales companies, because I don't think the yearlings would tolerate it. But again, with the overland scope, if there is an subepiglottic cyst there, you will see it, because with the movement of the epiglottis, you will see it, it will become evident. And so we still mainly remove these by the traditional laryngotomy wound, and you let the cyst pop out and you remove it at the base, but they can be removed by laser as well. This is an interesting condition. It's called epiglottic retroversion. So the epiglottis is now flipping right upwards. And we just have a little, just watch this guy, he's normal at the moment. We've got a little bit of ariepiglottic fold collapse there as well, you can see that. Now, look at this. So the epiglottis is beginning to should do another minute here. Okay, so the epiglottis is flipping up. This is quite an unusual condition, and it's a difficult condition to cure. but there is a laser ablation method of one of the, get the name of the right joint now, my anatomy of the thyroepiglottic joint, and you think there's a method of lasering that to sort of seal that joint articulation to keep the epiglottis in place. Pharyngeal wall collapse is another condition. So these are all conditions that are new conditions that we never knew existed until we started doing overground or exercise scopes. On the right, on your right there, you can see where the dorsal pharynx falls down. So that's the roof of the pharynx falls down, completely blocking off the airway. His epiglottis and his soft palate are perfectly normal. His arytenoids presumably are perfectly normal. You can't see them there now. But in this case, on the left, everything again is normal. But we look on the lateral walls. These are these walls at the side are beginning to collapse in. They're collapsing in a little bit, and obviously affecting performance. So that's just a small number of the unusual images that we see. So I want to know get some take-home messages. Is that resting endoscopy can be unreliable. I'm not saying it's useless. Of course, if you go in there and you scope and he's got grade 5 paralysis or grade 4 paralysis, you will see it. But if you do a rest, and there's another point of contention. You scope a horse at rest and he flips his palate, and at rest, and say somebody says, oh well, he's flipping his palate. Very many normal horses, you scope them at rest, will flip their palate and displace their palate. And so I don't think you can draw a correlation between scoping at rest and a horse displacing his palate and saying the horse has got a palate problem. Jockey reports can be unreliable. The absence of noise does not mean there is no problem. Many horses improve with fitness and strength. There's no doubt about that. Overground endoscopy is very helpful to make an accurate diagnosis, and also that there are often multiple things going on at the same time. You know, if you're going to operate them, you want to correct all the things correctly, as many problems at the same time as you can. Surgery is not always needed initially, but if required, it's vital to do the correct procedure. And sometimes it may be needed to do repeat operations. And I will be of the school of thought that I would like to try and get away with as least intervention as possible. So I would be inclined to go along with the least amount of surgery. And okay, maybe you might find you do that and it hasn't worked and you have to come back again and do some more. Now, I understand there'll be some situations where flat trainers and 3-year-old careers under pressure for time and you throw the kitchen sink at it. That's understandable. And that's why every case is got to be taken in isolation. And I suppose some cases are not worth operating on. I mean, that's the other thing that the overground scope helps, is that if the thing is so disastrous, you can pull the plug there and then and not carry on any further. So, you know, it is of economic use to both you and the owner. And that's it. And this is the new team of the Troytown Grey Abbey. And I counted up all the years that we have been in practice, and it comes to 190. So there's 190 years of veterinary experience among everybody there. Thank you very much.